Ever wondered how trailblazing risk leaders navigate uncertainty with finesse and confidence? Uncover the surprising connections between their personal journey and professional prowess, and get ready to learn and elevate your risk management game with the RiskMasters podcast. Join host Julien Haye in collaboration with Risk.net as they delve into hidden gems of risk leadership through engaging conversations and thought-provoking insights from board directors to chief risk officers and business leaders.
Risk management is not about colors and matrices, it is about people. Risk management is evolving, and so must we. In today's conversation, Horst Simon, a pioneer in risk culture and people risk, challenges traditional models like the three lines of defense and risk matrices, advocating for a change and a future where every employee becomes a risk manager. In this episode, we dive into why historical reporting is no longer enough, how leadership and culture shape real resilience, and why organizations must stop resisting change to thrive in an unpredictable world. Horst shares lessons from a career spanning continents, industries, and decades of transformation, and offers a clear call to action for risk professionals and executives alike. If you find this conversation valuable, please don't forget to like, follow, and leave a review. Your support helps us bring more leadership insights to the RiskMasters community. And for more resources, show notes, and articles, please visit aevitium.com. I'm Julien Haye, and this is RiskMasters. Welcome to this new episode of RiskMasters. It's my pleasure to welcome today Horst Simon. I would say a veteran in the space of risk management and risk culture. Welcome on the show.
Thank you, Julien. I appreciate the time, and I appreciate you sharing this with your network. And I'm looking forward to discussing my career and some really interesting risk culture aspects with you today.
Superb. And talking of career, you had a remarkable career spanning operational risk, banking transformation, clearly risk culture, as you just mentioned, working across multiple continents. So you had also seen different cultural aspects. What were the defining moments that led you to focus on risk culture as a core passion?
I think in the early days when operational risk started, the Basel definition, banking is my background, and in the Basel definition it says people, processes, systems, and external events. And we traveled around Africa doing all these risk assessments and doing risk profiles for the bank that I was working for operational risk. And I said one day to a colleague, it's people, process, systems, and external events. We're doing a whole lot of things around processes and systems. External events we just pray about, and we're doing nothing about people. We're missing the people aspect of this. And that's where it started. I think it was around the early 2000s. 2004, GARC published my first article on people risk. Before we even thought about risk culture, that evolved later on. But that's where it all started. It started with, we are really missing the people aspect of what we term operational risk to be.
And I remember in 2003 seeing the first Basel II, I think, framework, which was really about just collecting incidents, right? In the end, there was really nothing about actual risk management of operational risk, and as you say, never mind culture. And you just gave an example of that, challenge conventional risk management approaches. What sparked you to become a non-conformist and challenge the way things were?
Again, it is coming back to the people. I think we focused for a very long time. People focused on what I call the outdated ones or the dead horses, and all of that is really just collecting historic data. We've all been through that. I personally did the risk matrices and the red, amber, greens and things early in my life, but I think it's time that we really move away from it, because it just gives you a picture at a point in time. So we spend hours doing risk assessment workshops. We get this red, amber, green thing and we put it up, and And for a very long time, people believed that if you were able to produce a risk register and a risk matrix and a control assessment, you are actually good at the management of risk. And again, they've completely forgot about the people aspect. You can have the best risk management ever. You can tick all the boxes. If Johnny gets out of bed at the wrong side in the morning, he doesn't care about your policies and procedures, or she. And the emotions and all those kind of things impact how that person will respond to any situation of risk that day. So that to me is where we have to move away. We have to move away from just those historic pictures. Yes, we do need them, and I often get those arguments from people that if they look at my radical risk management process, I often get the articles, but you're ignoring the past, and I'm not. If you look at that in the middle part, it says risk intelligence. So yes, you do have to take the information from the past. You do have to learn from your mistakes, and it's always cheaper and easier to learn from the mistakes of others than your own. And we need to look at that, but then where risk management comes in and where we move away from risk management to the effective management of risk, that's where we look into the future and we look at the things that will prevent us from achieving our objectives. We don't just look at what was the picture last week.
Yeah, and to that point, in one of your articles, why risk culture building should be the most important item on the board agenda, you clearly mentioned that the board tend to overlook risk culture, which in my experience can be actually very, very true. What do you think boards should be doing differently and how to make them prioritize risk culture?
My easy answer to that, and the one I always give, is read less reports, ask more questions. Because the risk reports that the board get, I always say they go through a process of sanctification. They get better the higher they go. So very often the risk reports they get are nice and colorful, historic information that is cleaned up to be only good news. Now, I've seen many boards sitting there for hours and talking about what color something should have been at the end of the previous quarter. And that's a complete waste of time. They should be asking questions about what is out there that will put us out of business, what is out there that we need to really focus on to take opportunities with those risks to make more profit, get more reward. So my advice is ask more questions, read less reports. Sitting there for hours talking about red and the green is just as bad as worrying about how much petrol was in your car last month. It doesn't help you to manage where you want to go today.
Yeah, it's really risk management by figure and colors, as you mentioned here, which is clearly not forward-looking. And clearly, as you mentioned, you pioneered the concept of risk culture way before people really started talking about it. How do you think the perception of risk culture has evolved over the past 20, 30 years?
I definitely see a real growth in people looking at it. I really see some of the regulators really looking at it. When I was living in the Middle East, I went to Pakistan for many years to do risk culture training in Pakistan. And it is one of the first countries that I know of in the world where the central bank has actually put risk culture in their operational risk guidance. We've recently seen that the new Banking Act in Botswana, which is just next to us here in Namibia, the new Banking Act requires reporting on risk culture. So there's definitely move. We've seen the OSFI in Canada. They're not there yet because they don't call it risk culture, but they definitely focus on the cultural risk aspect. So they're getting there. So I think around the world, there's definitely a lot of focus on it. There's a lot of realization that, for years we've been missing this people aspect, and you can never take the human factor out of the management of risk. And I think people are starting to realize that, and things are definitely improving. Sadly, on the other side, there are suddenly so many experts coming out of nowhere claiming to know everything about risk culture. And you would see my nonconformist posts always, it's not meant to be criticizing them. It's just meant to be, let's all talk the same language. Let's not talk about a strong risk culture as a good thing, because even a bad risk culture can be strong. Let us define the levels of maturity and let us all just speak the same language. You are welcome to use the 5 levels of maturity. I'm not in any way gonna say, this is my intellectual property and you cannot use them. Anybody can use them because we should all speak the same language. If it's a bad risk culture, it looks like this. If it's a good one, it looks like this. If it's an effective one, it looks like this. And that's all I'm trying to achieve with those posts that people sometimes see as criticizing them. I'm just saying, let's all speak the same language and go forward with that.
And to that point, many organizations really struggle actually with embedding risk culture, sometimes in policies or definitely beyond policies and frameworks. So what do you see the biggest barriers to be, and how can business leaders overcome them?
I think the main barrier is, and that is not just with risk culture, that is with everything associated with growing away from red, amber, green, and those kind of things, is that resistance to change. People have been using 3 lines of defense since it was born. It has died in 2020 and it changed to 3 lines, which in my view is still not a great thing, but it's people resist that change. That's our biggest problem. I think the second biggest problem is a lot of the business leaders today did not grow up with risk management as a concept or as a discipline. So they read these executive summaries of reports and things, and so board education for me is where you start. If you really want to be successful, you got to start to educate the board. What is risk culture building? And you clearly need to make sure that they understand also that it is not an implementation project. You cannot implement risk culture ever. There's no blueprint. There's no one size fits all. Every organization is at a different level of maturity and a different stage of implementing risk processes and procedures. So you have to build on what is already there and build the risk culture on top of the organizational culture. Sometimes you have to fix the organizational culture before you can build risk culture. So the resistance to change, not knowing, and then not supporting it. Many of the older risk culture work says it starts with the tone at the top. It really starts with the tone at the top. It's not untrue, but very often people don't start there. And the third thing that really is a problem is very often there's a whole disconnect between the risk function and the human resources function. When I do the training, I always say that if you want to succeed with risk culture building, HR is your next new best friend. Because you do have to do that, because ultimately if you don't build it into the performance assessment systems, it's not going to go anywhere. So it's an ongoing process. It's not an implementation project. It's ongoing. It can only stop when you go out of business. And that means you haven't succeeded at building an effective risk culture. Until then, it can never stop. Very often people call in consultants. I've done that in the past myself. They call in a consultant, you do this, everything for us, and it's now in place. So for the next 6 months, they do not do risk culture awareness with all the new employees. So 6 months down the line, they are already far in reverse because these new people don't understand what it's about. So you got to do a maturity assessment, work from there, and then make sure it is a continuous ongoing process that never stops. It is evolving and things will change, and we have to change with the times.
And to that point, I think the risk function, and you kind of mentioned that, but the risk function has a core role to play in there, which in my experience, it doesn't always do. Why do you see the risk function roles in there, and what should they change actually to be more effective at driving that cultural change?
Yeah, very often I've seen where if you want to build risk culture and people really understand the human resources connection, then they just want to move that to human resources. But risk has got a key role to play, and it's all about educating the employees. Even if we talk about the 3 lines that I don't like and that I think doesn't work that good, if you decide to hang on to the 3 lines for whatever reason, teach the first line risk management skills. But very often, I find when I do these workshops, I find that people tend to stop thinking about risk when they walk through the door. They manage all the risks of getting to the office on time. Doesn't matter how they get to the office, they manage all those risks, they get to the office on time. As soon as they start doing their job, they don't think about risk. And that's the 4th pillar of risk culture building. Make every employee a risk manager. So if you really want to hang on to the 3 lines thing, my advice would be you will achieve 100% improvement in success if you teach the first line people risk management skills. It should be there on every job description. People have a job description and it says at the bottom, and any other duties assigned. So just above that should be functional risk management duties. Because every employee must think about their decisions and what is the best decision to take to manage risk in that situation to the benefit of the business and themselves. And a lot of the things we teach in risk culture building with the 4 pillars, it's not just something that applies to your work environment. You can do that at home, and you will be better at the management of risk at home. So the four pillars can be applied anywhere. Recently, a colleague published an article on our website linking the 4 pillars to cyber risk management. And we're thinking of starting a series of that to say, this is how you link the 4 pillars to different kinds of risk.
Cyber is very much a prime candidate for what you just mentioned, right? Because every single employee in that context represents actually a cyber risk. And by the way, it doesn't matter at which level of the organization they are. I think the higher up they are, usually the bigger the risk they represent. Yeah. In fact, it's a perfect segue to you are a very strong vocal opponent. In fact, I think you use the term killing the 3 line of defense, and there is even an hashtag as well. I think it's hashtag kill3LOD. Yeah. What do you see its biggest flaws, and what alternative model do you advocate? And you kind of started touching down on that, but can you develop a little bit better, a little bit more?
Yes, certainly. I think originally with 3 lines of defense, the whole issue, and a lot of people around the world, a lot of risk practitioners highlighted that when we started to think about the people aspects. The focus on defense. Yes, they said the first line is your first line of defense. So they should be managing risk, but then they made the mistake of never teaching them any risk skills. If we go back 20 years, if there was a risk conference, and it's maybe still the case, if there's a risk conference or risk training, they send the risk department people. They don't send other people for risk training. So the whole defense thing broke down because those people didn't understand what they have to defend against, because they had no idea of risk management. So that's where that broke down, I would say. And then just the connotation around defense. Defense is that negative thing. And then if you look at 3 lines of defense, you immediately start thinking about the World War II's trenches, where they were shooting from the trenches, and no war is ever won from the trenches. You have to get out of the trenches. So if you look at first line, they failed because they were never trained. They didn't understand it at all. Then you get to second line, and second line was seen as a level of policemen walking around. Negative. People didn't like risk department. In many organizations, they still hate the risk department because these are just policemen walking around trying to find where the hole go through the Swiss cheese. And then you get audit. Now, the third line of defense, I won't even talk about the fourth and the fifth, which is the other junk that has come up in the meantime. But the third line of defense, by the time anything gets to the attention of audit, what do? They can issue a finding. The loss is gone, the money is gone, the process didn't work. So rather teach the first line risk skills, and you can actually do away with the rest in a way. I said once at a conference in Dubai that the main purpose of a chief risk officer should be to work him or herself out of a job. They must get people so good at the management of risk that they don't need a risk department. And I got a whole lot of comments on that. And I probably will after this also get a whole lot of chief risk officers on my back. But people should manage risk in the organization. There shouldn't be anything related to risk that audit need to issue a finding for. It shouldn't be there. Because if audit issues findings related to risk, you failed down the line completely. And what we often do is then audit issue this finding, and we go and put in a whole lot of new controls. So 5 years later, after hundreds of audit findings, we have 1 million controls that cost us $5 million to manage a $1 million risk. And we never go back and we look at the cost effectiveness of the controls against the level of risk. We just keep on putting in new ones because audit is saying we're not good enough. So we just become better and better and better at spending more money on controls instead of using that money to train our people risk management skills.
Yeah, I've seen that time and again. And interestingly enough, I was challenged by the audit function in a former life when I flagged that instead of putting more control, they should look back into whether we should have that risk in the first place. And if we didn't, perhaps remove it altogether. That would be far more effective for the organization by changing the underlying activity and the way it was done, than keeping a risk with lots of control that shouldn't be there in the first place. This is not proper risk management.
That looking back in that sense is very, very important, because if you are experiencing an increase in internal fraud, or you are dismissing a lot of people because of internal fraud and non-compliance, your problem is your recruitment process. Your problem is not the people. Your problem is your recruitment process. And we very seldom link those things back and go and explore what is really going on. And that to me is fix the problem. Don't just try and put in more and more controls. Fix the problem.
There is a tendency to focus on the symptoms rather than the actual underlying cause, right? And I think that's very true in what you mentioned. I've seen that as well in high technology incidents. But when you start peeling the onion, I also find that a lot of the time people actually know what the issue really is, but you're moving into those untractable, difficult things to fix that people don't really want to do. But until you touch them, you're going to keep repeating the same problem time and again.
Yeah, and you're just putting in more and more controls that cost you more and more money.
And I think it's a very good segue into, in one of your articles, The Three Lines of Defense and the Ponzi Scheme Paradox, you argue that the model creates a false sense of security, which is the same with control, right? Can you expand a little bit on that? And how does it manifest in terms of real-world risk failures? And I think you already gave an example with fraud, but can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think one of the issues there is this false sense of security come from when your reports are only based on historic data. And to give you, I can give you an example of why I make that statement is in an organization that I've seen before is for many years the auditors were looking at the audit ratings. They were tracking the findings. They were really focused on what are the audit ratings for different parts of the business. And on the other side, the operational losses was tracked by the operations department. They were within the limits and the risk appetite and the budget because it's a banking example. So in banking, you will have operational losses. So banks actually budget for those things and they have limits and tolerance and risk appetite for operational losses because it's part of doing business. But for many years, the auditors tracked their stuff and they looked good. For many years, the operations department tracked their losses and they were within appetite. So they were technically green, if we talk colors. But the minute I put those two pictures together, the business with the best audit ratings had the highest losses. And that's where, both the audit reports said everything is okay because we're looking great. Both the loss report said we're okay, it's all green, we're within appetite, we are fine. So both those reports, in a way, created that false sense of everything is okay. Everything wasn't okay. They did an investigation and they fired the head of audit because he was just everybody's friend in that business giving good audit ratings. So that's why if you look at different reports from different parts of the business, and in essence there, the risk report as well. The risk report generally, I already said it gets better as it go up, but generally the risk report is just as at last month or last quarter. I've seen very few, I did see some, but very few risk reports in my career where there's anything about emerging risks that will prevent us from meeting our objectives. We sit and discuss inherent risk and residual risk as if it's important. I recall in the early days, they even said the difference between the two is the value of risk management, which is the biggest load of nonsense ever. Don't even worry about inherent risk. Don't go and try and look at what would your business be without any controls. It's a total waste of time. So in my life, I've never worked with inherent risk. I've always said this is risk. I didn't go backwards and try to say how big it would have been without controls. What's the use in doing that? And then justifying that as the existence of risk is even totally absurd. But we need to look forward. We need to look at emerging risks. But we cannot identify all those emerging risks. And that is where risk culture comes in. Risk culture is about how every employee will respond to a situation of risk in that situation every day in their jobs as those things come up. So they need to know risk skills. I have an example where we had a social unrest incident, and it started on a Monday morning. The computer in the old days we made backup tapes, so the computer center made their backup tape on Saturday when they closed, and it was running and then Monday they would take that tape and they would go lodge it somewhere else. The old system of keeping backups before we could do it online. So Monday morning there was total civil unrest, and it escalated into almost civil war. But it really calmed down, and by Wednesday, nobody went to work. It was total chaos. Wednesday, the computer center operator called me, the shift leader, and she said to me, I went to the bank, I took out the backup tapes. What should I do with them? Because we didn't know whether this will flare up again or whether it is now the end of it. So I got the tapes. We took it outside of that country and we ran the system. And when everything calmed down, we restored the backup tape. We opened the doors. The other banks were still running around trying to think what to do now. And that is one person thinking about what is the best way to manage risk to the bank in this situation. Everything is on their tapes. I need to get them. It was in no business continuity plan. It was in no duty list. It was one person thinking about what is the best risk decision I can make. And that's what we want. We want people every day, as they're doing their jobs, constantly to think about what is the best risk decision I can make in this situation.
It's a lot about preparation, isn't it? And one of the things I'd love to get your views on, in my experience, connecting to something you mentioned before around emerging risk, there is a lack of risk strategy, actually. In fact, sometimes there's a lack of business strategy altogether. So, which means you can't have a risk strategy if there's no business strategy.
Yeah.
Which then has a direct knock-on impact on, if you don't know where you're going, you don't know what could derail you.
Yes. And you will also never be able to identify any opportunities.
That's correct.
With proposed risks or with risks coming up. So it is important. I think it's very interesting you mentioned strategy because I've been formally working for 45 years this year. I've seen a lot of those in my life. And for a very, very long time, businesses had one view of the future on which they base their strategy. Nowadays, you see people are looking at 3 or 4 different views of the future, which again would call for 3 or 4 different ways of looking at risks associated with those 3 or 4 different strategic views. But yes, I think as strategy moves into becoming better and more broad and taking a lot of things into consideration, risk need to follow that. You can't have a risk function looking at things that we know today, but we have 4 different views of the future and we don't think about risk in those 4 different views of the future.
And in that context, and I see that in my day-to-day job, whether it's with nonprofit financial services and other organizations as well, the translation of the strategy and the risk strategy itself into what does that practically mean from a cultural standpoint can be very challenging. I suppose that's a simple way to put it. What would you advise to organizations to how to measure company risk culture maturity and to do that effectively in a way that will resonate also with people?
Yeah, I think definitely you need to measure risk culture maturity. There are different ways of doing that. Very often people look at risk, looking at the standards, and then they tick the boxes. Oh, we comply with this. And then they try to relate that back to risk culture. Very often people spend hours of interviews. They spend lots of questionnaires and those kind of things and surveys. What I really realized is those don't really work because you get people's views. I've had personal experience. I've done a so-called risk culture maturity work for a company in the UAE, and you do all these interviews, you talk to people, you do surveys, and rate yourself from 1 to 5 and everything. And I did the fancy report and presentation, and I went to the executives, and they took one look at that and at me, and they said, well, that's your perception of our business. That's not our business. So after that, I built the Risk Culture Maturity Monitor, which is an online system where it is still subjective. People still answer questions, but they cannot manipulate the outcome of the assessment. So it's still their views, but the answers to the questions are scrambled. So you can't work out which answer is linked to which level of maturity. And the weightings and the mathematics behind that, you cannot see as a user. So I've used that for a long time when I was a consultant. That system is now commercially available through a company in the UK. But to me, that is the way to go. It is the only system I know of that take into consideration the people aspects and the risk framework and risk process aspects to measure risk culture. Because your risk culture is not just based on the human psychology. It's also based on what is in place in terms of risk management policies and processes and procedures. How do people understand them, and how do people use them? So you cannot do just a psychological test and say this is risk culture maturity. You cannot do just a technical risk framework kind of assessment and say, oh, link this to risk culture. You got to put those two things together. And that is, to me, that's what I would say. To just start risk culture without any kind of maturity assessment is not good, because you need to get that picture where you are. And then you need to say, okay, what do I do next to move forward? And then what we advise our clients is then you go every second or third year, you reassess. Because if you assess today, it doesn't matter what you do for 6 months and you then leave it, within 3 years, that will all be gone. So you can regress or progress with risk culture, and you need to constantly check that. The other benefit of really using a proper system to do it is you can then negotiate things. If you can negotiate insurance premiums. If you have measured, you've done some work, you've remeasured, and you show a 7% improvement in risk culture, properly measured, you can say to the insurance underwriters, listen, I am a better case than my peers, so I want to pay less. There is an example where we've done that, and the company saved $150,000 a year in insurance premiums because they were able to demonstrate why they say they are a lower risk than others in the same business. So definitely measure it, but constantly monitor it. So remeasure at least every 2 or 3 years so you know whether you are going forward or you're actually going backward. And I've already mentioned the example. One example of going backward is you do it all and then you never train the new people coming in, which will make you go in reverse.
Yeah, and to that point, I've seen organization having also a certain form of culture and going through a significant growth period and recruiting a lot, except that the type of people they brought were fundamentally different to the people they had historically, and that started shifting the culture.
Yes.
So it's not only new people coming in, actually, it's sometimes you can completely dilute your existing culture as well, simply by bringing a different type of people.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it links back to what we talked about earlier on on strategy and risks there. It links back to that. You know, one of the big problems is we do this 5-year strategic plan, and then we lock it up in the drawers of the executives because this is now, this is now top secret. If the strategy is not known to every single person in the business, how do you want them to take good risk decisions that align with the strategy? That's a big problem that I've seen in my career. The strategic plan gets locked up and it's only the executives that know. If nobody else knows, how can you expect them to take good risk decisions to support your strategy? You can't. And the same goes for the importance of risk appetite. A lot of risk reports show things green. They're within risk appetite. In my view, they should not even be in the report. Because if anything is within risk appetite, why are you worrying about it? But the problem is, again, that the risk appetite is not known to all the employees. The speed limit is 120 kilometers per hour. If that's not on signs against the road or next to the road, you don't know that. You will drive 240 if you have a nice car. So how can you not tell your employees what the risk appetite is?
That for me is also...
How do you want them to take decisions that keep you within the risk appetite if they don't even know what the risk appetite is?
It's a fundamental difference between managing credit market risk, where I'm coming from that world where that is cascade down, right? So you have complete transparency around how much risk you can take. It's measured at the employee level who are making the decision versus operational risk where it really isn't. And that, I would say that distinction or paradox of management is very prevalent in a way, especially strategic decisions are being made as a result, which impact the way businesses are being conducted. And I'd like to go back to actually that point around people risk. How do organizations underestimate people risk, and what should they do to really better manage it?
They need to really understand their people, and I think it's difficult to go and measure it. Yes, we do all the psychological tests, we do background checks and everything. For example, we'll do education checks and everything before the person joins. He joins from university, so everything checks out fine. He did well at university. He's qualified now to work for us. But that's the only time we look at that associated people risk. 3 years into this guy working for us, he's got a wife and 2 kids and a gambling problem and a drinking problem, and we don't even know about those because we never ever again looked at the risk profile of the person working for us. That's one element of it. I think the other element of it is, and it goes back to the whole first line discussion thing, we don't make sure or train the people risk skills. We started the Dubai Center for Risk and Innovation within the British University in Dubai many years ago, specifically because we identified that there's people come through their university career, come into the market, but nowhere did they learn about risk. So we definitely need to, if I have my way, you're going to start teaching risk management at least at high school level. But people need to understand the basic skills of risk management. And it's not probably something new. We can say, okay, crazy to put it in the high school curriculum, but it's already there. People are learning all kind of risk things, but they're not told those are risk things.
Yeah, they're not branded as risk, but we all make risk management decisions day in and out in our daily life. So,
we get so used to it that we that we stop doing it when we get to the office.
And one key component in what you were mentioning within an organization is really having a risk-aware leadership team, right? And you talk about turn from the top, but for me it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
How do you cultivate those traits within executives? And I would actually even go beyond that. Do you think there is time where organizations should get rid of executives if they don't meet the requirements?
I would say yes, because if they keep them, just to answer the last question first, if they keep them, they won't be in business for very long, because the world moves on. The pace of change, the speed at which things are changing, and the size of that change is much bigger than years before. Every year it gets bigger and bigger. And with that, your exposure to risk goes up. So if you don't look at that exposure to risk, you will not be in business for very long. So I think it comes back to the article why risk culture building should be the key thing on every board agenda. We have to get people to understand risk, and we have to get people to think about how do we take better decisions every day on our jobs. And that's where the whole 4 pillars come in. The 4 pillars of risk culture, the first one is think differently. The second one is get the whole picture. Third one is build the risk intelligence system. And the last one is make every employee a risk manager. So if we look at think differently, we got to get everybody to think like a risk manager. And I always use the example that even the janitor who cleans the toilets is a risk manager, because he or she puts out that sign that says wet floor. That's risk management at its basic, but we're doing it without even thinking that we're doing risk management. The second one, the second one of getting the whole picture is look beyond the obvious things. People always just look at, what they are used to and how they've grown up, and they apply that. But the world has changed. So look beyond just the obvious things that are in front of you with regards to the level of risk you're exposed to. And then build, I used to say build the risk intelligence system. Nowadays I say build and use the risk intelligence system. That just is getting information from inside the business, which could be your risk reports is a key element of that, and outside the business, which is more important than your risk reports. What is out there that will put us out of business? Where's the world moving towards that will have an effect on our investment portfolio, our lending portfolio, the contracts that we get to build roads? What are all those things that will influence whatever business we are in? And then the last one is obvious, make every person a risk manager. Teach them the skills, the basic risk skills. You don't have to send them on a $10,000 risk training course. Just teach them the basics. How to identify risks, how to think about those risks in terms of what are the goals and objectives of my department, what is the risk appetite that I have to operate within, and then leave them to make the decisions. And, very often I say, does your risk management process motivate or irritate your employees? And 99% of the time, people say the risk processes irritate us. Why? Because we have to do all this data and stuff, and we have to give it to risk for the risk report, and we never get anything back that will help us. Just give that, if you look at risk culture maturity and specifically linked to risk reports, we don't track whether you have a risk report. That's the very lowest level of maturity, is having a risk report. If that risk report is as live as possible and available on the intranet, that will help to move maturity. If that risk report is different versions given to different levels of people in the organization to help them to take better decisions, then you achieve a much better level of maturity. So having a risk report is no level of maturity. That's the basic bottom line. giving it to people to help them to take better decisions, that will move your maturity up.
I think I would invite anyone to read about what happened to Credit Suisse and Archegos, right? Because it's a perfect example where the intelligence was there, the risk report actually flagged there was a problem. Nobody did anything with it, and as a result, it cost Credit Suisse 5.1 billion, if I'm not mistaken. So having the best system in the world has never replaced an actual culture that enables people to use those tools.
Yeah. I think maybe a little thing to just highlight is, and there's a lot of talk in human capital and human resources about psychological safety. People need to be able to speak up. The days are gone when risk was for the people with the gray hair. Risk is for every single employee. It is our job as the ones with the gray hair to teach the other ones what we've learned in 30 or 40 years, and to help them to take businesses into this new level, this new thing of constantly managing risk. I think there's still an article on LinkedIn, which I wrote many years ago, where I said, gamer boys and girls will be the best chief risk officers in the future. And it's still the case. They've learned active risk management through gaming. So maybe it would be a good thing to make every CEO a gamer and get them to learn some real live risk management skills.
Yeah, you were talking about pace of change, and I had on this show Roger Spitz, who wrote about, I don't know if you know about him, he's a specialist in foresight, he's a futurist, and I'll let you listen to the show because it's interesting to understand what it practically means. But one of the aspects he talked about is the pace of change and the fact that we are shifting from a world that was fairly linear and as a result predictable to a world that is completely interconnected and completely unpredictable as a result. And risk management needs to adjust as a result of that.
Yeah, I'm 100% with that. We really have to move away from the old concepts and the old processes and the old things. Even ISO 31000 is under review currently, but even that process, it's just gathering historic data. So I really think we have to move on with a more forward-looking view. Definitely focus on the 4 or 5 different views of the future for any kind of business, and really collect information. And it's easy. It's not a difficult thing to look at emerging risks. You can even set up Google Alerts that will tell you stuff that as it's published. So it's not rocket science to look at emerging risks, but we ignore that. We don't do it. We will rather sit for 2 hours in a board meeting and talk about what color something should have been last quarter. And then say, oh, okay, did you see what's happening in the world? I won't give some examples because my latest examples might not fit our audience. But have you seen what happens in the world? Where in life have you seen, tell me in an email what you've done last week? The world is moving and we have to move with it.
And I'd like to build a bit on your, we say, cross-cultural experience as well, right? Because you work in Africa and Asia and Middle East. I think you also worked in Europe and Northern America. Have you observed any cultural differences that explain how people approach risk management? And how did you take that into account when it comes to actual risk culture and risk management?
Yeah. I think that's a very good question, Julien, and I've certainly experienced that in the Middle East and Asia, and when I do the Make Every Employee part of risk culture training, we're looking at worldviews as part of that. Now we have 3 worldviews. We have guilt versus innocence, which is more the Western culture. If you steal $1 million, even if you give it back, you are still going to be guilty because you stole the $1 million. Now, If you look at the Middle Eastern cultures, a lot of that is around honor versus shame. So if somebody steals $1 million, if the person gives it back, the whole family apologize, and the honor is restored, the person might just keep their job. And then you get the third worldview is the tribal thing, which is around power versus fear. So in the tribal cultures, which are prominent in many parts of the world still, if you steal $1 million, they'll just come for you. Now, in Dubai, where 90% of the people come from somewhere else in the world, I had to deal with that. You have to write risk policies, risk procedures. You have to build risk culture that take all three of those worldviews into consideration. And then on top of that, you have all the other things. You have emotions, education, biases. All those other things influence how people think and respond to a situation of risk. So the guilt versus innocence person, they have that focus on when they look at risk. The honor versus shame person have a different focus when they look at different situations of risk. And the power versus fear guy have a completely different focus when. So you have to be able to manage that. And on top of that, it's not just the emotions and those other aspects. It's also the generational aspects. When I grew up, and probably you as well, where your parents said you find a good company and you work with them for life until you retire and you get the golden watch. The average 30-year-old in the world has had at least 3 jobs with 2 different companies. So a very different perspective on risk from one generation to another generation. And right now, with Generation X finishing off university and coming to the office, you have at least 3 to 4 different generations in the same office. And the old people think about risk very differently than the young ones, and you have to have risk policies and processes that makes them all happy, otherwise it's not going to work. So all those factors come into building an effective risk culture. And all those things you need to be aware of, and you need to think, and you need to track how people will respond to a situation of risk because of those things. Nowadays there are people who are saying public transport and transport you book on apps are so readily available, I'm never in my life going to buy a car. There are people that say, I don't want a house. I don't want to live in one city for the rest of my life. So I don't want to own a house. I want to be able to move within a month to another city somewhere else in the world because that's my style.
World again is changing and culture is changing, and one aspect to that and cornerstone to make it work is technology, and you've already talked a little bit about using actually technology even to assess risk culture, right? How do you see technology playing a role in strengthening risk culture? You gave us that example of that maturity assessment, but going beyond.
I think if we talk technology nowadays, the first thing anybody is going to say is artificial intelligence. How is AI changing? And there is definitely a place for that. I think it can add value to certain things. I think it can even take over a lot of audit kind of functions and control kind of functions and things. So I think artificial intelligence will improve the management of risk, and it will definitely change the way we manage risk. It will probably be much easier to have that what is going outside my business driven by some AI component. But there are also other risks. Artificial intelligence, really that risk of ethics and the question of who actually owns it. And sadly, I think the biggest thing and the most important thing is it is not a brain transplant. Artificial intelligence is a tool. Many people use it as a brain transplant. They will post these things on LinkedIn, which is a cut and paste from ChatGPT. I wonder very often, do those guys really, do they realize how bad that is for their professional picture out there, that they just cut and paste from ChatGPT? And, if I want to know something, I'll ask ChatGPT myself. You don't need to ask ChatGPT something and then cut and paste it to LinkedIn to make as if you know something. You know nothing. ChatGPT told you that. So use it as a tool to help what you're doing and to improve what you're doing. And I think we must have that same focus for risk management in the future. It is a tool that will help us. It cannot replace the way we manage risk.
Well, at least I would say not yet.
Element to keep in mind.
I would say not yet.
Maybe, yeah. Maybe it's so good that it just replaces everything, but not in my lifetime.
And again, it depends on the type of risk. I had on this show, Britta Hackman, where we talked about algo trading. And it's a perfect example where extreme automation, never mind AI, is actually replacing to a large extent the way market risk operate in that context, or shifting the role of market risk more from doing the monitoring and managing to actually driving the strategy that is then implemented in the tool which execute all of it. But that's again a different type of risk. And I think when you think about risk management, AI will impact very differently different strands. Credit market risk are prime target, in my view, for extreme automation and the use of AI, but also with some of the more areas of concern around biases and decision making on the back of it with the data available.
Yeah, if we can eliminate biases to get a picture of a risk, where in past it's a workshop and we have 10 people and we try to get them all to agree and this is now it. If you can use AI to eliminate those biases and things in that kind of situation, it will definitely help. But yeah, it can never replace risk culture building because you can never take the people out of that equation. But it will definitely help us to improve. I'm just concerned about those two things. The one is the ethics, and the other one is really people shouldn't just use it as if they've now replaced their brain with it.
We're saying, I like your example on LinkedIn because I see countless of those things. And
the horrible graphics with all the spelling mistakes and things. If you put that out and you're telling me I am a risk expert, but you post that thing, I wouldn't think about you as a risk expert.
Oh, yes. One aspect, again, I had on this show with someone else, with Teridio, and we are talking about actually banks sometimes and financial services firm in general tend to turn a little bit into technological firm because they all have digital transformation programs, cloud, etc. And in that context, how do you see, or how should organization balance innovation, digitalization journeys, technology with risk governance?
Yes, it's very important, and I think it's key that we talk about this because definitely what we see in a lot of the systems out there, we talked about risk management systems, which my view is known out there, is just an expensive historic data collection tool. But all other systems, I think what we should do moving forward, just as we are building risk culture into our people, we should be building what I call risk technology management principles into our systems. We should be building controls and risk management factors into the systems. Many years ago, and I won't mention which bank, but many years ago I worked for a bank where my job was to do with risk technology. And it wasn't just about the technology we use for risk management. It was about how do we build risk management into all the technology that we use. Because what we find now is business have their specifications. They send out a request for proposal to vendors. The vendors come back. Business decide which system to buy. 5 days before they go live, they call risk. Can you come and have a look at this? Because we're going to go live in 5 days. Then risk ask all the questions, and then you get this thing of, you are an obstruction to business. You don't want us to progress because you're asking all these questions. Involve risk management before the request for proposal go out, so that the risk requirements can be built into the system. Have risk management there when the vendors come to showcase and demo their systems, so that risk can ask their questions. Don't call them 5 days before you go live. That's too late. So that would be, even with digitization and that, involve risk management from the early days. If you have a plan to now onboard people digitally for a bank, involve risk management when the project starts, not once you've bought the system that will do this digital onboard. That's too late. So that would be my thing. It doesn't matter what you do, call risk first.
And that applies actually to technology, to your point, to product, markets, etc., isn't it?
Yes.
And if I come back to something you mentioned around the role of regulators in the context of shaping those discussions, and I would say helping organizations by setting the standards in a way and requirements to shape risk culture. How do you see the regulator's role in that context?
I think they definitely need to keep up with the times. I've given comments on the risk culture initiatives in Canada and also for the European Central Bank. I put in my comments. We do lots of other things. Probably aware that in 2012 with the Institute of Risk Management in the UK, that was one of the first risk culture studies and papers that we put out in 2012. 2023, we've done a big global study with the ACCA, and those reports and everything, they are there on the ACCA's website. People can just go there. So I think people need to keep up with that, and regulators as well. I think the resistance to change that we talked about that you find in business, you find that with regulators as well. We are comfortable in doing this supervision this way, and we've been doing it this way for 20 years, and we haven't had a bank that failed, or we haven't had a telecommunications company that failed. It goes for all regulators. Keep up with the developments and the future of risk. And I think the big role is to support those that you regulate. Move away from we want to catch you to we want to make you better.
It's about prevention, isn't it? And being proactive rather than reactive.
That proactive thing is for me is key. If telecommunications authority in any country are looking at proactively at risk and helping all the operators to be better at the management of risk, there's benefit in that for everyone. Risk is not a competitive advantage. How you manage risk is also moving away from being a competitive advantage. Everybody has got access to all kinds of ways of managing risk. How your people think and respond about a situation of risk every day in their jobs, that will make the difference.
And I think it's perfect segue to the next point around what are the key lessons from past, I would say banking failures, but organizational failures regarding risk culture that you've observed and you think would be useful for people to bear in mind?
The most important lesson there is that we didn't focus enough on it. We focused on the systems, we focused on the processes, we focused on compliance, ticking all the boxes, rather than empowering and training our people to be better at the management of risk. So going forward, yes, we need to change the processes. We need to look at a better way of having a risk management process. We need to move on from all those outdated tools and outdated ways of reporting. But for me, it comes back to the key element, and maybe I'm a bit biased here because of the work we do with risk culture builders, but it comes back to the people. Help others to be successful. And that's been something it's been my motto for a few years. If you help others to be successful, that's better for all of us. The competitive advantage doesn't lie in the systems and the processes. The competitive advantage lies in how do your people respond to a situation of risk, and how do your people identify opportunities to take more risk for more reward. How do you get away from wasteful expenditure by having $1 million worth of controls to control a $50,000 risk?
I'd love to get your thoughts on, I would say the top three, because otherwise you probably could spend another hour just on that point. But what would be the top three emerging risks you see risk professionals and executives should pay attention to in 2025?
Yeah, I've said this a few times this year already. The biggest risk out there is risk practitioners hanging on to the dead horses and the outdated systems and processes. That would be my top risk. Doesn't matter what happens in the world, if you're not catching up with the way you manage risk, you'll be out of business. The second one is in my mind, definitely the aspect of cyber. Everything is connected and interconnected, and it's really a big thing out there. Personally, I think we could, if we don't get it under control, we could end up in a situation where we would possibly not be able to get any cyber kind of insurance. People will just not insure it because of the level of risk. So I think we quickly need to really get our act together with how we look at cyber risk. And I wouldn't say global politics and that, because I don't really get into the politics side, but the result of a lot of things that contributes to the erosion of social cohesion. A whole lot of factors in the world contributes to people getting more and more unhappy with where they are and what is happening. And that erosion of social cohesion, that would be my third one. I know it's a big thing that there's a lot of factors that plays into it, but breaking people down and taking away their basic rights of living and stuff, that will create a major issue for us.
And we are seeing a lot of that nowadays. Now I'd like to take our discussion probably to a close with a bit more personal reflections and look back on your career as well. What would be the one risk-related concept or framework you once really believed in and later changed your mind on?
That's an interesting one. I have to think about that one. I think maybe the biggest change for me was to really, from the early days, we did risk the old way. We did the assessments. We draw the matrices of 1 to 5. We even put colors on the matrix and said, okay, this is within risk tolerance. And that. So I think for me, the key lesson was stop focusing on the stuff and focus on the people. because at the end of the day, that's where the difference comes. So my biggest lesson was, although I trained people in doing risk matrices and I trained people in all those kind of things in the early days, the biggest shift for me was really moving away from that into what if every person has risk management skills and every person think about risk as they do their jobs. That was for me a big lesson and a big change.
And if I connect that response to the next one around, what will be your one piece of advice you will give to young risk professionals and leaders if they want to really have a big impact on their organization?
I would say help others to be successful. I think for the last couple of years, that's been how I approached a lot of my work and also a lot of training and consulting kind of engagements. Help others to be more successful. If you are the chief risk officer, help your other executives to be more successful. If you are the supervisor of the cleaning team, help them to be more successful. Doesn't matter at which level of the business you are a leader that can help others to be successful.
It's a beautiful advice. And I hope that everybody is going to take this one to heart, because it's extremely important to empower other people, isn't it? And you lived and worked in how many countries? I think I counted 20, but is that correct?
I physically live in a lot less. We lived in 5 different countries, but I worked for periods in many others. I think it was up to about 20, where I physically worked like 3 weeks or longer at a time. So a lot of that contributed to the way I think about risk and the way I understand risk. You can work in a country where it's quiet today and tomorrow morning there's a bomb explosion and you have to take a detour to the airport. That is a very different experience that you have somewhere. So I think all those experiences, all the different cultural interactions, all of that helped in shaping the 4 pillars of risk culture and shaping the conversations around risk culture that I share with others nowadays. But yeah, I've been blessed to travel to many countries and deal with many people, and many of them had great input to the way I think and my career over the time.
And if you were to take one lesson you learned from all of that, what would it be?
I think it comes back to help others to be successful. The lesson in the early days was one of my managers early in my career said to me, on your way to the top, make sure that you don't step on anybody because you might need them on the way down. So I think that was good advice very early in my career. And I think that evolved into what I say today, is just to help others to be more successful.
And if you were to give a TED Talk tomorrow outside of risk, what topic would it be?
Sure. That's an that's an interesting one. I guess it would, preferably be risk. But if I have to give a TED Talk other than risk, I think that would be don't resist change. I think the TED Talk would be, don't resist change, embrace change.
And what's next for you and the Risk Culture Builders?
That is also a good question. Risk Culture Builders, there is the website, and people can get some articles and things on the website as well. Risk Culture Builders, many may think is a business, but it is not a business. It is just it's a collection of risk practitioners that really understand risk culture building and that really drive that message. So all of us work independently, but collectively, looking at opportunities and things like that. So it's not a business. It's more people helping other people to be more successful than it is a business. I think a lot of things that we do a lot of webinars and articles and things that is just there to help people. It's not generating income and things like that. So the future of risk culture builders, I would love to have more people, but they really need to go through the process and understand what we stand for. It's something I would love to see going on for many years to come to help people. So we definitely need less people. Well, I won't say less people with gray hair. We need more people with no gray hair to come along and commit to this kind of helping others to get better.
And finally, where can our audience follow you, your work, and get involved in a discussion?
Great. I have a number of people following on LinkedIn. I think they're just over 30,000. But there is a specific group for risk culture called Global Risk Culture Builders. There's a group on LinkedIn for that. It has in excess of about 10,000 members at the moment. So people can easiest way is to join the group on LinkedIn. We put a lot of information there. And then if you're interested in any of the other things and our latest articles and things like the Ponzi scheme one you mentioned, that's available on the website, which is simply just riskculturebuilders.com.
Well, Horst, thank you so much for this discussion. I think we covered a lot of ground. It was a real pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Julien. I appreciate the opportunity, and I would really encourage everybody out there that's in risk management, don't resist the change and help others to build an effective risk culture as you go through whichever business or organization you are in.
Well, thank you so much again, and I hope to have you again on the show soon. Bye.
Thank you very much. Keep well and enjoy the rest of the time.
Thank you for tuning in into this episode of RiskMasters. I hope you find today's conversation with Horst thought-provoking and inspiring. From rethinking outdated risk practices to building true resilience through culture and leadership, Horst shared powerful lessons on how organizations must evolve to succeed in an unpredictable world. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like, follow, and leave a review. Your feedback helps us continue bringing you top insights from industry leaders. For show notes, additional resources, and related articles, please visit ivcam.com and stay connected and join us next time for more conversation on risk management, leadership, and resilience. And remember, real risk management is not about ticking boxes. It's about empowering people. Until next time, I'm Julien Haye, and this has been RiskMasters.
Thank you for joining us on RiskMasters today. If you're ready to master risk and unleash your full potential, here's how you can take the next steps. First, head over to julienhaye.com to discover even more valuable insights from our RiskMasters. We've got a treasure trove of knowledge waiting for you. Second, don't miss out on future episodes. Hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcasting platform. Stay tuned for fascinating discussions on risk management. And third, if you found today's episode valuable, please share it on social media. Help others discover the world of RiskMasters and embark on their journey of risk mastery. Remember, success favors the bold. See you on the next episode of RiskMasters.